Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Darrin Lipscomb, the CEO of Ferretly and a 30-year veteran in the technology industry. Prior to Ferretly, Darrin has launched several software and consulting startups that included unique, forward-thinking solutions focused primarily on Fortune 500 companies and government organizations. Let's welcome Darrin Lipscomb to present on the topic, Social Media Screening, a Modern Approach to Employee Risk Mitigation.
Hello and welcome. My name is Darrin Lipscomb and I'm the founder and the CEO of Ferretly. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about social media screening, why it's important, and I'm going to introduce you to some case studies that illustrate the risks of not performing social media screening. So this statement speaks for itself, and it sums up why the background screening industry exists, and it's why it's a $4 billion industry worldwide and growing. And it's also why over 95% employers use background checks. It's important to look at some of these employee risks in more detail. So I've highlighted in green what we typically think about and use as a rationalization for running a traditional background check on candidates and employees. But what about these other risks in blue? And this is really where social media screening can play a big role. We are seeing an explosion of defamation cases, workplace harassment, discrimination, and more. And what your employees say online can make you liable. And this damage to your reputation can often lead to lost customers, revenues, and even employees. Just to give you a quick real world example, maybe you remember the Virgin Atlantic incident. This is way back in 2018, where 13 cabin crew members were fired after they made candid comments on Facebook about the airline, the passengers, and even the planes. So social media screening can play a critical role to mitigate these risks. Existing screening approaches fail to answer the critical questions, such as, is this employee a good fit with our team? Or how have they spoken about past employers publicly and how they treat others? So we know that high turnover and toxic employees can affect your team's morale and cost you money. When we consider the cost of turnover and factoring in indirect costs, such as recruiting, training, reduced morale and productivity, these costs can exceed $240,000 per employee. And that was a study done by SHRM. In regards to risky behaviors, we need to answer the question, are employees acting in a professional manner around customers and other employees? So social media screening can also identify potential workplace violence incidents before they take place. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And lastly, insider threats. Customer information that's being leaked by insiders costs companies millions, and 35% of breaches are performed by insiders. Yet companies spend a great deal on cybersecurity, but often they neglect employee monitoring as a preventative measure. So I think this slide best illustrates what you're missing when it comes to only performing traditional background checks. As an employer, you want to consider all available data, especially when it comes to making an important hiring decision. Traditional background screening, including criminal checks, credit employment verification, drug screenings, that they really fail to address many of the risks posed by employees, especially as it relates to their online behavior, which actually can have a more outsized impact from damage to your brand and culture, and also from a safety standpoint. So here's some key stats. It's anticipated that over 4.5 billion social media users in just a short few years. That's almost half the world's population. Social media is how people connect. It's how they share information. It's how they consume their news and entertainment. And it's often how they get their next job. If you want to understand the demographics better, according to a Pew Research study, almost 70% of adults and 80% of teens in the US use social media, which shows you it's increasing in just about every demographic or every age group. Perhaps the most striking stat is according to a 2018 Career Builder survey that found that 47% of employers wouldn't interview a candidate who wasn't online. For example, employees stated that invisibility leaves the impression a candidate has something to hide. All right. So we might ask, why is social media becoming so popular so fast? And the bottom line, it has a reinforcing nature. So this is a paper that was published by Dr. Sperling from Harvard Medical's McLean Hospital. And it showed that using social media activates the brain's reward center by releasing dopamine. That's a feel-good chemical linked to pleasurable activities such as sex, food, and social interaction. So it's analogous, think about a slot machine. So game players knew they're never going to get money by playing the game, then they never would play. So the idea of a potential future reward keeps the machines in use and the casinos making money. So the same thing goes for social media sites. I'm just looking for likes instead of money, right? Last point here is that many studies have come out in the past few years showing linkages between the amount of social media use and anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. Ultimately, corporations have a duty to ensure well-being of their employees. So some of you might remember this incident back in 2013. This is an actual tweet from a PR executive at IEC prior to boarding a flight at JFK Airport to Cape Town, South Africa. IEC is a $10 billion publicly traded international company which owns brands such as Vimeo, Home Advisor, and the post went viral. By the time Justine landed in South Africa, it forced IEC to fire her shortly after that incident, and it created just a PR nightmare. So here's another similar incident. In 2012, Lindsay Stone lost her job helping disabled adults at her nonprofit because of this Facebook post she posted mocking silence and respect sign at Arlington National Cemetery. She was miming a scream while holding up the middle finger. She was also fired from her nonprofit, and they had to issue an apology. So as you can see from these examples, your brand is truly at stake. And many of you have probably heard the term cancel culture, where social media users basically gang up on a company when they believe the company represents an opposing ideology. It could easily be triggered from a simple racist mark from an employee. And recently, Yelp helped institutionalize cancel culture by implementing a new policy to tag business on their site if they're accused of racism. The bottom line is that organizations need a way to mitigate this risk. So how do you protect company culture with heightened politicization and just about everything these days? That's the true question. And we also are seeing more remote workers that spend more time on social media. And again, there's clear links between mental health and social media usage. And we can't forget the cost. When factoring in hidden costs like lost productivity, lowered morale, and diminishing brand, the turnover cost can be as high as 1.5 to 2 times an employee's salary. That's according again to SHRM. So here's another real world example, but this time it's from an insider threat. In early 2017, this Air Force veteran, Sarah Winters, who went by the name Reality Winter, was hired by a government contractor to translate foreign intercepts from Persian and Farsi to English. She was highly outspoken on social media about Trump, as a lot are, but she also sympathized with Iran. Later that year, she leaked NSA classified material about the 2016 Russian election interference, and she ended up being charged federally and sentenced to 5 years in prison. This is just one example of her tweets that could easily have been vetted with social media screening for political speech. As a result of this, her employer took a huge PR hit, and ultimately they were forced to sell the company. So social media can also tell us a lot about mental state or health well-being of an employee. And this chart represents the actual sentiment of Reality Winter's posts leading up to her release of classified material and subsequent arrest. So by analyzing sentiment of posts over time, we can identify potential issues with regards to mental well-being. A little bit more stats here. There's 2 million incidents of workplace violence each year in the US. That results in 450 deaths on average. In the United States, assaults are the 4th leading cause of workplace deaths. When I saw these statistics related to incidents of workplace violence, I was shocked, and quite honestly, it really drove me to create this platform, especially when we consider the correlation between the rise in social media use and the rise of workplace violence. Daniel Davidoff, who's a manager at Global Security at Risk International, wrote an extensive article on linkages between social media use and workplace violence. And he cited linkages such as moral outrage and righteous indignation and other mental health factors, as we discussed earlier. More importantly, though, there was an FBI study done in 2018, and they published the results of warning signs of mass shooters and state that half of the shooters exhibited leakage. In other words, they discussed the idea of the act with others, and in many instances, this was over social media. So violence in the workplace falls upon both HR and corporate security. And this is where we believe AI, especially as it relates to continuous screening, can have a huge impact on mitigating this risk. This is another real world use case that occurred just a few years ago in Pennsylvania at a Wise Market. Randy Stair had worked there several years and posted these pictures and tweets prior to barricading himself and 3 coworkers, who he then proceeded to shoot before killing himself. So for all these use cases, artificial intelligence, namely machine learning and natural language processing, is needed to analyze the potential massive volume of posts from candidates and employees. I've actually spoken to companies that have performed this task manually with dedicated staff, but what we found is it just becomes overwhelming and ripe for mistakes, which can often turn out to be fatal. Automation and AI is absolutely required to scale across an enterprise, and it can be used to identify risk in both text and images. And by looking at sentiment across sufficient volume of text, we can glean information about the emotional state of the subject. So taken together, this can provide critical and timely information about employees in order for the organization to get ahead of the potential problem. So what can AI detect? Here's just some of what we would consider to be toxic behavioral risks. Some of these overlap, such as I might post a picture of a table of booze from the night before, but also discuss how drunk I was at the party. So both of these could be flagged and often represent distinct risks, but it's important to consider the body of risk in the aggregate. In other words, is there a pattern of drinking or partying, and for instance, for this employee? So just like you cannot draw a conclusion about the climate with a single weather event, unless of course you're a politician, you shouldn't draw a conclusion about a candidate based on a few posts. An important aspect here is that AI can be extended to include not only negative aspects of your candidate, but also identify positive attributes. So think about donating or volunteering. And this is really where social media screening can truly differentiate itself from traditional screening methods. So the true value is AI is that we can analyze thousands of posts and images in minutes and present a readable format for a human to review. We would never recommend, though, AI only process to make a hiring and firing decision. Human analysts are always needed to ensure accuracy. So this probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone on this call, but in 2018, that same Career Builder survey of 1,000 mid to large size companies, they found that hiring managers in those companies were already looking up candidates' social media and, more importantly, using this information to make a hiring decision. So from that same survey, those that were polled said that the reasons for not hiring, they included provocative photos, drinking, drug use, discriminatory comments, and even criminal behavior. But here's the catch. If you conduct a do-it-yourself social media screening, you can easily fall victim to privacy and discrimination concerns, just simply because of the amount of information that's available to you. So burying your head in the sand regarding your hiring manager's use of social media to vet their new hires is not a strategy. Hiring managers can easily see information from social media that could prejudice their decisions. Best practice is to document social media screening policy. That's number one. The second thing is use a provider that is both FCRA and EEOC compliant. And third, get consent from the applicant. This will allow you to stay objective and also provide more thorough and unbiased analysis of your candidate's social media. Lastly, avoid running up against EEOC violations. So ultimately, this is about getting the information you need while protecting you from discrimination claims. So what can we glean from the analysis? Ideally, the social media report will provide an understanding of post frequency, risk makeup, and allow the hiring manager the ability to quickly make a determination about a candidate. You can also be alerted of possible mental health issues, allowing the organization to become more proactive. So employers have realized that screening an employee wants pre-hire is just simply a snapshot in time. It does not provide an appropriate picture of who your employee is today. And that's where continuous background screening comes into play. Through continuous screening, especially as it relates to social media, we can often make a determination of well-being and current risks to your employees, your brand, and yes, even your customers. So this is the question we get most often. Is it legal? Well, to answer the question in the US and Canada, the answer is absolutely. In the US, the FTC ruled that as long as the provider follows FCRA rules, Fair Credit Reporting Act rules, Social media is no different than any reporting based on public records, for instance, a criminal background check. So you always want to outsource to a consumer reporting agency that follows FCRA guidelines if you're hiring in the United States. And that includes things like limiting the public information access to 7 years and also having a repeatable, consistent process that guarantees some level of accuracy. Bottom line is don't do it yourself in an ad hoc manner. That's going to open you up to inconsistent, possibly implicit biases from different hiring managers. And yeah, possibly EEOC violations. With that, we're going to open it up for questions. So the floor is now yours. So there was a question of the ethical aspects of using AI in screening. So I'll go back to, there was a slide we talked about using AI to help hiring managers make more informed decisions, right? So first off, we're only looking at public posts. This is only what your candidates are saying out there in the public realm that anybody can see. Secondly, we want this to be consistent and unbiased. So actually, AI can actually help in that regard. But the most important point here is that it gives you the information to look at to an analyst, and then we compare that. We make sure that result is accurate, right? So we go back and look at the actual, a human will look at the post, look at what the AI gives you, and then make a determination there as to whether that was accurate. So really the AI is what we always refer to as it's doing the heavy lifting, right? And it's also taking out those biases. So if a hiring manager is looking up your Facebook, A, did they even get the right Facebook account? And B, is there implicit biases sort of creeping in? So this is really where AI can sort of remove that, right? And provide a more consistent approach. So I think the answer is yes, absolutely. It's ethical. And it actually helps in that regard. So the second question here is regard to screening that varies significantly across geographies. How do we standardize screening across, I guess that's geos? Again, a post is a post, no matter from, I can only answer from a social media standpoint, right? But what someone says on Twitter, in the UAE is no different than what someone says here in the US. Only probably the distinction will be the language, but understanding those norms and what defines sort of toxic language is really important, and it's a great question. And that's where it comes down to the machine learning training sets, that they have to be specific to not only language, but the regions in which you're hiring in. So what would be considered maybe toxic language or political speech in the US may not be considered in other countries around the world. So it's important to have very specific machine learning training sets that are created for those specific geos. Next question is, does the system only look for negative posts, I assume, or does it screen for positive? And the answer is yes, it does both. You can define what you would deem as a positive post, and then the system can actually flag for that as well as the negative post. So that was one of the sort of clear distinctions between that and a traditional background check. You don't have that luxury, right? So the nice thing about looking at social media posts is we can actually say, you know, this person's doing great in the community, you know, outspoken, very personable individual, etc. Next question is regards to mental health. Would it allow us to be proactive? And I did. Can I elaborate on that? Yeah, and absolutely. I think mental health is a key issue here with social media screening that really no other type of screening mechanism can really address. And that's where I talked about in my slides, where we saw Sarah Winter, who was the intelligence officer hired out of the Air Force to translate from Persian and Farsi to English. and you could see her sentiment dropping over time and turning negative overall prior to her releasing that insider information, that NSA top secret information, and then subsequently getting charged and arrested. I think absolutely, I think sentiment can address this. I think the body of posts that are getting flagged, things like self-harm, there's usually correlations between lots of political speech and then threats of violence as well. So there are these interrelationships between different risk factors that, when taken in the aggregate, I think can really point you to a possible mental health issues. Next question is wondering how organizations can determine risky behavior from the post. So that's really up to the individual organization. You can, in the Ferretly system, you can actually tailor your risk factors. You can toggle them on and off. So you sort of define, if you don't glean, obscene language as a risk, you can just simply turn it off. You don't flag for those. So also with the custom keywords, you have the ability to really extend out and get very refined in terms of the types of things that you're flagging for. So you have a lot of latitude, a lot of flexibility to define what you would deem as a risk to your organization. Next question has to do with key learnings, especially during this pandemic, that all HR needs to update themselves with. Well, I think, again, this sort of goes back to well-being of the employees. I think when more people are remote, there's been studies that show that can impact, suicidal thoughts, drug use, etc. So I think having lockdowns and being isolated, I think certainly can play a role. I'm not a doctor. I don't pretend to be one, but I think the mental health aspects is something that, again, social media screening can help, as one data point, can help maybe identify. So next question has to do with the US FC Fair Credit Reporting Act requirement is to give an applicant notice of adverse data. How does this work with social media screening? First off, you need consent, right? That's the number one. Secondly, the report itself, the social media report, should be your adverse action report. So if that report or if that data were used to make a hiring or firing decision, then that report would stand as your adverse action report. Ended the questions.